Now, we move on to our second session, Metrics of Memory and Identity, which delves into the profound connections between memory and identity. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Aminatta Forna, an award-winning author whose powerful narratives have captivated readers across the globe. Known for her insightful exploration of themes like memory, identity, and resilience, Aminatta's works have garnered critical acclaim and a loyal readership. Today, we have the honor of hearing her insights firsthand. Please join me in welcoming the remarkable Aminatta Forna. Joining her on stage will be journalist and author Nirmala Govindarajan. Please give both of them a big round of applause.
Wonderful to see you all, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm going to start with a short reading from my memoir, The Devil That Danced on the Water. I wrote the book 20 years ago. It was my first book. It's just gone through a republication last November to celebrate the 20th anniversary. The book really tells the story, and actually, I think we take off very much from where Vijay Balan left, about writing about family. The book was inspired by my family, the events in my family, specifically the death of my father, who was killed by an authoritarian leader in Sierra Leone in West Africa, where he came from, in 1975 when I was a child. When I grew up, I decided to investigate the facts around his death, which had really swirled around our family as a secret for many years. All my life I have harbored memories, tried to piece together scraps of truth and make sense of fragmented images. For as long as I can remember, my world was one of parallel realities. There were the official truths versus my private memories, the propaganda of history books against untold stories. There were judgments and then there were facts, adult stances and the clarity of the child's vision, their version, my version. There were times, a summer holiday or a few months, when I lived my childhood as a seamless dream, where time ebbed like the tide and there was nothing to break the rhythm. But for the most part, that was not so. Over and over, the delicate membrane of my sphere would be broken, and I tumbled out of my cocoon into the outside world. Afterwards, no one explained. People imagined that these were things children shouldn't know, or they did not think we had a right to know. We were encouraged to forget, dissuaded from asking. Gradually, I learned to spy. I eavesdropped on adult conversations, rifled hidden papers, devised lines of questioning, and I began to build onto my fragments layers of truth. And as I did so, I discovered how deep the lies went. I grew older, became a journalist, and made a living using the skills I spent my childhood honing. All the time I hoarded my recollections, guarding them carefully against the lies that hardened, spread, and became ever more entrenched. Yet what use against the deceit of a state are the memories of a child? In the African oral tradition, great events and insignificant moments, the ordinary and the extraordinary, are notches on the same wheel. They exist in relation to each other. The little occurrences are as important as the grand designs. The threads are the texture of truth that separate man-made myth from fact. They are the testimonies, the words of history's eyewitnesses.
Thank you, Aminatta, for that very poignant reading. And thank you, Ala, for having us here today. And what you just heard was Aminatta setting context to the focus of this discussion, which is on memory, the matrix of memory and identity. You know, I met Aminatta just yesterday, and we've had some brief interactions. This wonderful author of British writer of Scottish and Sierra Leonean ancestry, now lives in America, quite an eclectic person, a deep person, who's taken us through many lanes down memory, back to the 70s, when she was still a child and experienced her very first personal loss. A loss that has channeled her sensibilities, her thought process, and the way she has channeled her creativity to tell stories of identity, conflict, and loss. Could you take us to that day you lost your father and tell us how his end came about? Also, the ensuing incidents of conflict and loss that has shaped your growing up years.
Well, I grew up in a failing country. I grew up in Sierra Leone, which was a country that had recently become independent from the British Empire and had, to put it briefly, set off on the wrong path. And this was a story that had really been mirrored all over Africa. For Africans, Western-style democracy was a very new experience. And one must always remember that the British, although they vaunted democracy, and I know I don't have to tell this audience, although they vaunted democracy, they did not rule democratically. Right, they ruled by force outside Britain. So nobody had ever seen how a parliamentary democracy would work. And so it was an instrument that was very, very quickly and easily subverted by men who wanted power and control, right? They were handed a gift. And that's what happened in Sierra Leone, and it happened in many countries across the nation, so across the continent. So the book, The Devil That Danced on the Water, is subtitled a story of a family, a country, and a continent. My father saw what was happening. He came of age at the same time as his country. We call them the Renaissance generation. For you, they were called Midnight's children, the children who were born at the stroke of midnight. The Renaissance generation was slightly different. They were in their 20s when their countries came of age, and they were the generation that was supposed to lead their country into the future. They were trained to be doctors and lawyers and dentists and diplomats and bureaucrats, accountants, all kinds of, create this professional middle class that was going to lead the country into the future. What happened, in fact, was they were betrayed. When I really began to research the facts of my father's youth and youthful ambitions and his ideology, I realized that actually maybe they hadn't been so naive. They kind of knew that they were set up, but they went forward anyway. They saw no option but to try to live up to that expectation. So my father trained as a doctor. He met my mother in Scotland. They had 3 kids, and then we went to Sierra Leone. And my father very quickly, seeing what was already happening in the country, became a political activist. He became an activist. They won the first election. The election was overturned. They were imprisoned, and he spent a lot of my childhood in and out of prison as a political prisoner. But there came a crucial moment then in the mid-70s when the man that he had followed and whose party he had had faith in, too became one of these leaders that wanted to introduce a one-party state. My father resigned from the government and set up an opposition party. It was outlawed overnight. I saw all this as a child, but none of it meant very much to me. My life was really about dogs, ants, trying to persuade my parents to give me the things I wanted. But it was outlawed overnight, and in the years that followed, my father really became political enemy number 1. He became the person that the dictator, Sheikh Stevens, most wanted out of the way. And despite many exhortations to leave, he decided to stay in the country and continue the fight. And ultimately, he was framed, accused of treason, and executed. So the last thing that I saw with my father, which is where I begin the book, is the day that the secret police came to arrest him. And I was alone in the sitting room, and I opened the door to the secret police. And I went to the room to get my father to say that somebody was here to see him. And he said to me, I have to go with these gentlemen now. And that was the last time we saw him. So the book starts there. And what I do is I trained as both a lawyer and an investigative journalist. So what I did was I traced everything, every fact I could find, the trail that led up to the point he was taken away. And that was the first half of the book, and the second half of the book is everything that happened to him after he was taken away.
God. I can only imagine what you went through when you heard about your father's execution and when you realized where he'd really been taken. I mean, what happened to you when you actually realized what had happened?
Well, I was lied to at first, so it took a while to realize what had actually happened. I was living with my stepmother at that time because my parents had divorced, and nobody knew where my mother was. And my stepmother chose to try to shield us from the truth, so it actually took a while before I discovered what had actually happened to him. And that came incrementally, so there wasn't a sort of single moment, but I knew he wasn't coming back. And I lived in Sierra Leone. So the very strange thing about my childhood, which was also, and this again, it's interesting having a member of your family like this, like Vijay Balan talked about, because for many years, ordinary people treated my father as a hero. Right, so I can remember getting in a taxi, and the taxi driver asked us, with my brother and sister, he asked us our names, and we said what our names were, and he suddenly turned around and looked at us, and you could see the shock on his face, and then he let us off the fare. He said, no, you don't have to pay me. So this is the kind of thing that would happen all the time, and yet I also knew that my father had been killed as a traitor. So it was it was confusing, and also I wasn't allowed to talk about it, you see. So there's a moment in my 20s when I was sitting in a fashionable restaurant in London with my brother and sister, and we were whispering about what had happened. And I remember thinking, why are we whispering? We're in London in this trendy restaurant. Why are we whispering? And I was, oh my God, we're so conditioned into secrecy that we couldn't break the spell. And so, writing really was a way of breaking that hold.
Yeah, it really sends chills down my spine. As I listen to you, you might have been sitting in a fashionable restaurant, but your thoughts were running so deep. Yeah. Your book really is an investigative journey, and also a very, a confluence of what happened to you personally and the political. So could you talk about that process of bringing out the first book on your father, Muhammad Forna's execution?
I don't see the book as being about me. I mean, I'm always very careful to try to separate anything about writing for personal reasons, because yes, we are often motivated by personal reasons, but writing can also really, really screw with your mind. Yeah. So, I always want to preface everything, and sometimes when I'm teaching writing, I always say this is not therapy, don't treat it like therapy. So, yes, there's a personal motivation. It was my father, right, and I loved him, and I wanted to find out what had happened, and I wanted to tell that story. But I still see myself as the narrator of the book, not the subject of the book. The book is about my father, and I am the narrator. But in order to tell the story in all its layers, of course, I talk about myself, and I investigate how that felt for me to go through that process. But, by the time I wrote the book, I had gone through quite a lot of the process. I think the toughest thing probably was the fact that I had to separate myself out of it in order not to put off the people that I was trying to get to talk to me. So one of the things I did was track down the 4 men who had given testimony at my father's trial and who falsely claimed that they had seen him planning on planting bombs and doing all sorts of things. And I had to track them all down one by one, which I succeeded in doing. And then I had to sit opposite them and I had to extract from them the information that I needed, principally the confession that they had done this, which eventually came, right? They had been paid. 1 had been beaten and tortured, and 3 had been paid. And so what I did, for example, was I never ever used the words my father. I always said Dr. Forna. So when you say you saw Dr. Forna, so what this did was it created this, kind of cognitive dissonance, that it separated them and me from my father. And then what happened was sort of quite magical, actually, because what happened is they forgot who they were talking to. And also don't forget, it's a very sexist country, so people underestimated me all the time, and I used that to my advantage. And I always said they didn't see me coming, including, for example, the chief of the secret police. I had to interview him as well. I mean, he was openly scornful of me almost throughout the interview until I kind of lost my temper, actually. But then I was sort of quite entertained to hear afterwards that when the book came out, he kind of never heard the end of it, because I wrote the interview exactly as it happened, including with me losing my temper and him eventually telling me what I wanted. So, there was quite a lot of subterfuge that had to go on, and that's the bit that was exhausting. It wasn't actually... Well, it was mining the emotional content, but, really what I had to force myself through as a journalist, as a writer, as an investigator was probably the toughest single thing.
That's what I wanted to ask you next. Did your years as a journalist help you do it this way? Because you were with the BBC for a decade before you took on this.
My years as a journalist both inspired me and helped me. So they inspired me because I was at the BBC working in the newsroom as a reporter when the war in Sierra Leone was ongoing, and I was so horrified by the reporting of the war across the British media that I quit my job and decided to write the book. And the reason is that the war, which was contemporaneous with the Yugoslav civil conflict, the Yugoslav civil conflict had been reported in a great deal of detail, every single faction element, until you became exhausted with who were the Chetniks and who were this and who were that. When it came to Sierra Leone, across the British media, they said, oh, here they go, the Africans are killing each other again. And they called the war tribal, and it wasn't tribal at all. The war that was tribal was the former Yugoslavia. Now, so actually I left in order, because I was so frustrated with journalism as a response to war, to what was happening. I left in order to write the book, but I took my training with me. So I then used all the skills I had as a journalist and in order to do that investigation. And then I also have my father to thank, because good African families are very much like good Indian families. It is, so, lawyer or doctor, which one do you want to be? And then, or if, like me, you weren't very good at the sciences, it was, so, what kind of lawyer are you going to be? And so I had actually trained in law as well. And that turned out to be very useful when I was going through the trial papers. I found the transcript of my father's trial, and I went through those. And I basically used every resource I could. And I was also helped by the fact that the country had been through, I went to Sierra Leone when the war was ongoing. It was just coming to an end. And I went to Sierra Leone at a time when people were absolutely desperate for answers. They wanted to know how we had got to that point, because the war in Liberia had been going on for decades. And, we always felt, well, they're Liberians and they're, kind of American. And, we all know how violent Americans are. But we're Sierra Leonean, and that's not us. And of course it was us, as many countries that experience war realize, is that humans are not that different when the gloves are off. So the people in Sierra Leone, people really, really came out and spoke to me about what had happened. And as the years passed, I couldn't write that book now, right? Because what happens, and Vijay Banan and I are going to have a conversation later on today about all of this. What happens is people start rewriting the narratives, right? And they suddenly realize, oh my goodness, I could be blamed for this, or I could be held culpable, or I was complicit. So they start reshaping their narratives. And so actually that's what took me to fiction, was I then wrote The Memory of Love, which was about what happens, how people reshape their narratives, and how they try to cover up their pasts, and how the truth starts becoming more and more obscured by different agendas. And so actually my next 4 books were all novels. I became a novelist and left journalism far behind.
Yeah. So while you write award-winning works, of course your works have gone on to win a lot of awards, you also run writing programs with context to conflict resolution. What is the significance of this program, especially at a time when the world is ruled by hatred and war, loss and misplaced identities?
Misplaced identities. Like, where did I put my identity?
A lot of people are going through it.
A lot of people are. And there's always, I'll just say a quick thing about identity, because I never really quite know what everyone means by it, but somehow I get tagged with it a lot, I think because of my background as being Scottish, which I'm dressed as today, actually, because I thought Seattle was going to be freezing cold, and Sierra Leonean. But I think the thing is that a lot of people are having their presumed identities tested. And, I've grown up always knowing that my identity was confusing for people. Actually, I was a lot less confused than anybody else was. But I think people are having presumptions tested, aren't they? And so they're now kind of thinking, well, hang on a minute, I thought I was this. And actually, I think the people who are having their presumptions of identity most tested are probably a majority, the people who thought that they were the dominant majority and thought that they were owed a certain kind of life. That's my guess, anyway. But talking about my program, and I can place identity in it, but in a different way. One of the ways in which identity is formed is through narrative, and it's called narrative identity. And there's some very good papers by a couple of psychologists on this subject. And how a narrative identity is formed, and you can all think about this in terms of your own life. The first way in which you begin to think about yourself is from the stories your parents tell you, right? They'll tell you family stories. They'll tell you stories about who you are as a family and how you fit into it. The other stories they'll tell you were fairy stories, legends, myths, whatever, right? And then you'll begin to be told stories by the wider society. You'll get the kind of, the sort of version of history that your country favors and all the legends that go with that as well. And you'll learn this at school, and you'll learn it through the books that you read. And you'll go into adolescence with this sort of received idea of who you are, right? It's basically been given to you by those closest to you and those who control the master narrative. And then around about your teens, you start reshaping it for yourself. And you start thinking about it more critically. And that is the absolute crucial point when narrative identity is formed, which I suppose is why our universities are sort of the locus of so much discussion about identity. So realizing that the course that I created was, when we first taught it and held a symposium around it, was actually about the United States and what was trying to identify what was happening to the United States, which seemed to be a country that had misplaced its identity, right? And so the course was called Reimagining the American Narrative. And I taught the course was in two halves. I taught certain books. One of them, I'll tell you about two of them. One of them was Clint Smith, who wrote How the Word is Passed. And the other one was Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer. So Clint Smith's book is really about the way in which the history of slavery is taught in America, or not taught in America. But what he does is he goes to certain places that are linked to America's slaving past, and he reports his experience, and then he tells you what the true story of that location is, right? Be it Monticello in Virginia, or be it Central Park, which apparently, I didn't know this, was actually once a African-American area in New York until it was bulldozed to make a park for a growing number of wealthy people on the Upper East and West Side. And then the other book that I taught was Viet Thanh Nguyen's The Sympathizer. And what he does is he reverses the gaze of the Vietnam War. And and this was, again, for me, who didn't know a great deal about the Vietnam War, and suddenly realized, oh my goodness, the only version of this war I have ever heard is pretty much the white American version. It's always been told through the American soldier who is destroyed by it, who comes back, who whatever. And Viet Thann's point was millions of Vietnamese died, but we never hear that story. Now, all of us who grew up in Empire know this story as well. As anyone here who's over the age of, 50 will remember school. I mean, the Sierra Leoneans were just the pink bit on the map. And that was the empire. And Sierra Leonean history, when I was at school in Britain, was taught in terms of what we exported. That was it, right? It was tea came from India, and gold and diamonds and rubber and cocoa came from West Africa, and that was it. Getting my students to read The Sympathizer, and he also came and spoke to the university, but also then taking them to the Vietnam Memorial Monument, and the controversy around it when it was first put up in Washington, D.C., because, again, this monument did something that hadn't been done. It started to challenge the narrative. I don't know if you know the monument, but it's this black slash, and it has all the names of the dead on it. Another attempt to challenge the narrative of that war. And eventually, the whole thing sort of rounded up in a symposium where we put together people from different disciplines, writers, yes, and writers who'd written about war and conflict, and were able to give their narrative accounts of it, but also diplomats and conflict negotiators and human rights lawyers and people who were engaged in the process in different ways.
Very interesting. And you also talked about how wars are fought twice. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I'd love to claim that quote, but it wasn't me, it was Viet Thanh Nguyen, but it's a very good one. He says, wars are fought twice, once on the battlefield and then again in memory. And I think that is true. It's, and the other one, of course, is, it's the victor who writes history, right? But the interesting thing about the Vietnam War was, of course, it wasn't the victor who wrote history in that particular case. It was the losers who wrote history. But the most powerful gets to dictate the terms of memory. I think one of the things I've always wanted to do as a writer is always put in counter-narratives. You can't overturn the whole thing, but what you can do is add narratives. And I've written about narrative identity quite a lot, and sort of thought, well, what was my narrative identity? And thought, oh God, I didn't actually get one, because the books that I read as a kid, no one like me ever appeared in them. I mean, women didn't appear in them 99% of the time, and black women certainly didn't appear in them. But I took this later on to be a good thing, because it meant that I had quite a nice blank slate to start with, right? And I think what you see with African women writers is that they have gone in and sort of filled in that gap. So, it's a fascinating thing. We are now in this, literature is at this pivotal point of being able to change narratives, not because necessarily everybody goes out and buys those books, but because there is a trickle-down effect that the new narrative can create.
Yeah, and We'll open it out soon to questions, but before we do that, I have one more question for you. How has you been writing a lot of fiction now? So how has that enabled you to reach your deeper self?
He's always going to ask me about my deep self. I'm a very shallow person.
That certainly doesn't come across in your writing.
Well, what a question. Fiction asks different things of you. Nadine Gordimer said, non-fiction reveals the lies, but only fiction, only metaphor can tell the truth. And I think that's true. You're reaching for a different kind of truth, not a literal truth, but a universal truth. And that is a much, much tougher call. My agent sort of one day joked with me and he said, you writers are all mad. And I said, no, it drives us mad. It drives us mad. The process of sitting down and extracting it from yourself, pulling it out of yourself and putting it on the page is so hard that it is no wonder so many writers take to the bottle and many other things. But at the same time, what I love about it, I don't have a therapist, for example. I spend so much time thinking, and thinking about what does this mean, and asking myself the toughest possible questions. And I go dog walking with a friend of mine who's a psychotherapist, and sometimes I think to her, you just need to read a book and write a book, and so I think in a way, therapy has kind of taken the place that literature used to occupy. And maybe we want to try and get that place back again, actually. It's made me, I spend a lot of time in my own head and a lot of time living with people who don't exist.
And that's how we get to read that spectacular literature. And on that note, are there any questions for Aminatta?
So I can ask everyone.
Yeah.
I think everybody can hear that. First of all, it was a great session. And I think you took us through the history, the traumatizing experiences. So I think you were really living through what you had experienced. And thank you for sharing that. So when we talk about the narrative identity, could be pseudo-identity. That's what, because you're adding things to it. So that's not my question. So now you look at the media landscape, which is changing. As you said, at the time of the Vietnamese War, people never realized what exactly happened because we only watched what happened.
Media. So nowadays this is happening again because there is genocides, wars, whatever happening around us. The paid medias are showing only one side of it. And the children in schools, they are not being, or history is not part of their syllabus anymore. And especially in the United States, every state has the freedom to choose what the children should learn in the schools. There is no centralized system of teaching them what the country has gone through, like slavery and all those. So this is very important, this type of conversations, dialogues and books and all those. But what do you think the coming generation, understanding the history or identifying who they are? So what is your take on it?
Disappointed in a great deal of the teaching. And it struck me that the teaching of history in his school was propaganda, not history. Right? And I remember asking him, have you done, what have you learned about slavery? And he hadn't learned anything. And I thought, still, even with all the discussion going on. And he said, well, he said that the reason they didn't do it, because I think he asked the teacher, and the teacher said, well, some people would be offended. And so I assumed he was talking about the white students, but apparently it was the black students they thought might be offended. I don't know why that would be, or whether the teacher was just, trying to come up with something to get out of it. But there's a sort of terror now of teaching kids anything that could be controversial. My personal take on it is that what I try to do, both with my students and my own son, is teach them critical thinking. Right? If you learn not to take it for granted, and I'm really, really astonished, and even in the early years of the internet, the extent to which people I knew who I had previously thought had a brain cell in their head would take it for granted because it was on the internet. And I thought, do you know who put stuff up there? And an early lesson I taught my son was, when he was little, he was I read it on the internet, so I said, why don't you look up at who Mummy's married to on the internet, right? Because for several years I was married to a gay man in Australia, and none of us knew this. And actually, when I finally found him and told him, by the way, we're married, because I found him through friends of friends of friends, the only thing was he had the same name as my husband. And, the algorithm just put us together, and so suddenly there I was, married to this man, and actually he had this chain of hotels, and I thought, well, the worst thing that's ever happened. But critical thinking is probably, teaching critical thinking is probably the only way. And I teach people, I teach what I call creative writing, but I don't actually teach people I make them write, because I think it's a very useful process. Because when you understand how to write, you understand how writing gets done, and therefore you understand all the judgments and decisions that a writer is making along the way, and how those can be highly subjective. But what I'm really trying to do is produce readers. Because I teach at Georgetown University, and Georgetown University has in it the School of Foreign Services. We have the School of Government. I mean, many of the students who go to Georgetown are people who want to run the world one day, right? And so I think if you come to my class and you learn how to read, and you learn how to read critically, and you learn how to read broadly, that probably is the best thing I can do, rather than try to produce more and more people who want to win the National Book Award. But critical thinking, I see as the only way forward to help young people through this morass of information and disinformation.
Thank you for this wonderful session. So a question on young people, right? You were saying that you need to teach them critical thinking. So this is a generation who lives on 30-second TikToks and 30-second Reels on Instagram. What do you feel the role of books and literature personalities such as you in regards to this generation?
Well, I wonder that myself sometimes. Well, it's interesting. People are full of doom and gloom, but 30 years ago, I wouldn't have been published. Right, publishing was completely dominated by people who didn't look like me. The kinds of books that were being published were mostly written by, certainly in the UK, where I lived for most of my life, when and when I'm not in Sierra Leone or in America, were written by white men. So, and I remember when the first Indian books started to be published in the UK and gain an audience and a readership, I remember the electricity that created. And when I wanted to write The Devil That Darts on the Water, the book that I was just talking about, I said to my agent, who, by the way, represents a huge number of Indian writers, because he saw what was happening, and he thought, right, he started to sign up Indian writers at a great rate. And I said to him, tell them Africa's the new India. Right, this was going to be our line, which is what we did, and then sold the book well. And Africa did become the new India, right? There then became this wave of African writing by African authors, and then actually what you kind of see is the centre shifting. So, I've been to literary festivals I've been to the Jaipur Literature Festival twice. I don't know how many people have been to it, but I mean, it's tens of thousands of people. I've never seen audiences that size. I've also, this year, I was at a literature festival in Kenya. Same thing, people buying books in large numbers. So, yes, there is this TikTok thing, but it's also a mistake to think that America is the center. The literary center has moved out of the West. It's not in Britain anymore. It's not in America anymore. It is in Kenya. It is in Ghana. It's in Nigeria. It's in India. It's in Pakistan. The Lahore Literature Festival I've been to, those really are the centers of the literary imagination. And those people are still reading. So, as frustrating as TikTok is, and whenever I see my son with his face glued to his phone, I want to grab it. But I also think, hang on a minute, our parents were always having a kind of moral crisis over something. In my generation, it was breakfast television. I couldn't believe they were going to put TV on in the morning. That was the sign of a terrible moral decline, right? And I also, a generation before me, there were parents who said to their children, get your nose out of that book and go outside. Right, so there's always something. So I think we shouldn't get too uptight about it. It is frustrating, and I do want my son to read more. But at the same time, I think that there are two parallel trends going on at the moment, and we should take some hope from that.
Is okay. I'm probably the oldest guy in this audience, but I have some general comments and a couple of questions. Maybe I will try to make it very brief. I have traveled all over the world, and then what I have seen is every history is actually written by the winners, and they write all kinds of lies. And even in Indian history, the Britishers wrote so many lies, and so slowly somebody is trying to correct those things and all. But now what has happened is it is the financial interest of the corporate people and other people who are trying to, propagate these lies that everything is good for you, and then you find out later on it is not good for you.
Right. Could you repeat that last bit?
That now we find out the corporations, they are making a product. They advertise everything is good for you. And it is for your benefit that we are making these things. But the money interest is nobody talks about that. And what I have seen is when you go to different countries. Now, I was in Peru, and our tour guide was an Inca PhD holder. And he said he was a Catholic. Now he's converting back to Inca religion. And because the conquistadors came and they just ruined their culture, ruined their language, ruined their worship places, everything. And they were forced into Catholicism. Same thing happened in Brazil. And all over the country, it is the same thing. So you go to different countries, you hear all these lies. So in India, what is happening is people who are over 50 or something, they develop a cynicism. Oh, it is something like that happened. It is their fault. So how do you teach to avoid cynicism and be constructive about trying to find out the origin of any of these things? So do you have any idea of, so we raise our grandkids to be free thinkers. And I have 3 of them, and then they are brilliant, and they learn things. Now with the AI, we are adding another proportion in that. So it has become a confusing world to trace the origin of a truth. And so this is where my comment is, my question also is the same thing.
So how do I teach against cynicism?
Yes.
Is essentially
Yes.
the question. Lead by example, I suppose. I mean, literally what I do in my class is, so I explain what the first half of the class is. We read what people have written and where they have countered narratives, whether it be Clint Smith or Viet Thanh. When the second half of my class, I ask my students to pick their own narrative and go and do the research and see if that narrative stands up, right? Whether it's a family story or whether it's something that they've grown up believing. I ask them to walk the walk, right? Go through the process of actually trying to uncover what the facts are and then what the interpretation of the facts is. I actually, I don't know if I agree with you that this is a particularly cynical age. I think sometimes that there's an odd mixture of cynicism and naivety sometimes, but it's about trying to harness those things and give people back some agency. And sometimes people can think, or let's say my students can think, or they can look at the whole global picture and think, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. And I just say, pick one thing. Pick one thing and change one thing. And there's a wonderful book by a woman called Anne Lamott, and it's called Bird by Bird, and it's actually for writers. So if any aspiring writer here, I can highly recommend Bird by Bird. But she tells a story about her younger brother who's got a school project and he hasn't started it, and it's nearly due to be handed in, and he's had the whole summer and he hasn't done anything, and he starts to cry, and it's supposed to be about birds, this project, and the dad sits with him at the table and he says, all right, buddy, let's just do it, bird by bird, bird by bird. You can't set out to change the world, but you can take one thing and try to change that thing, and that is pretty much how I approach it. Right, I take one task at a time, and that's what I do with my students. I say, take one thing and make that one your thing. And frankly, if 7 billion people did that, we might get somewhere.
Yeah. Thanks, Aminatta. Do we have time for one more question? Do we have time? Running late? Okay, you could meet her. One last question. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, you had mentioned that when your book came out, people who were involved in your father's assassination and other things started rewriting their stories. Can you give an example of one of the people who, how they rewrote their story?
Well, I mean, the people who were directly involved, most of them were actually dead by the time, things began to shift, and the others were now, their versions were written down. I was thinking more about the wider society. So, for example, I was interviewing a couple who were at the university. They were university professors, and I was asking them, well, when the first arrests happened, what happened at the university when the first arrests took place? People began to see that their freedoms were being impinged upon. And, the couple had no answer, and they were sort of prevaricated and this and that. And sitting at the table was their daughter, who's now a very good friend of mine. She is a human rights lawyer, and she was listening in on the interview. And her parents were saying, well, I don't know what you're talking about. The father was saying, I don't know what you're talking about. There was the university, and, what could we do? We just carried on working. What could we do? And he really didn't have an answer, and she banged the table suddenly, and she said, she interrupted my interview, and she said, she's asking you what you did. She's asking you what you did. And the answer was clearly nothing. And actually, so Memory of Love really kind of picked up that idea of So it was really about people who do nothing as opposed to people who do something. You know, what do people who do nothing make of their story afterwards? And so that friend then came up to me years later and she said, you know, it had bothered her so much hearing her father try to parry my questions and not answer them, and that she had asked herself, and she said, but I have the answer now, I have the answer now. And I said, what is it? And she said, well, oh, my father said he had 5 children, so he couldn't do anything. He couldn't do anything. And, you know, I didn't say, because I felt it would be cruel, but I thought, well, my father would have said the opposite. He had 3 children, so he had to do something. But, you know, what had clearly happened was her father sort of gone away and given it some thought and thought, well, this is my defense, right? He'd come up with a defense. But actually, what I do know now, I mean, I think people were scared, and I think it's fine to say we were scared. We didn't know what to do, or we'd never been politically organized. You know, we failed. But what they increasingly started to do was find defenses for inaction. But for people who actually were involved in the death, no, most of them had fled or died or been discredited, so I didn't have to face that in particular.
So word by word, Aminatta is doing something. That's word by word, and hats off to her. Thank you.